This week we're going to be talking about some basic cognitive development principles and also some issues regarding language.
We'll first begin with Chapter 2. Let's begin with a discussion of some developmental basics. When we think about development, there are three major ways in which we talk about it, and that's in terms of biological processes, socio-emotional processes, and the one that we'll focus on today, cognitive processes. Now, when we think about biological processes, you can think about these in terms of physical processes, such as maturation of the brain, physical growth in terms of height. With socio-emotional processes, we can think about these in terms of emotional regulation, how people think about themselves in terms of their identity. If I ask you how to describe yourself, for example, what type of things would you characterize about yourself? So it can be things like self-esteem, for example. And then cognitive processes involve how we think. And these include things like language development, attention, and memory.
We'll begin by looking at an issue related to development that deals with whether development is mostly a byproduct of nature or nurture. And when we talk about nature or nurture debate, what we're referring to is the extent to which development is influenced by biological inheritance, which is the nature part, or environmental experiences, which is the nurture part. And nature proponents argue that an evolutionary or genetic foundation produces commonalities in growth and development, whereas those in the nurture camp emphasize the importance of both the biological and social environment. Now, really, it's a combination of both, but when we talk about it, we're talking about to what extent does nature or nurture influence development, and what are potential interactions. Now, I have here a rhesus monkey example of the nature-nurture debate, and what it shows is that it's essentially both. So I'd like for you at some point to go back and review that podcast. It's really interesting because what you're going to see in this podcast is that these so-called bad genes that the rhesus monkeys have actually aren't bad genes when they have the right mother. So you have the bad genes, the nature part, plus the good mother, the nurture part, and what you find is that these rhesus monkeys actually thrive. Now, when they have the bad genes and bad mothers, they're delinquents, they have early morbidity, all sorts of bad things. And so you're like, why wouldn't you just select out these bad genes? But the answer is that it's a byproduct of the nature-nurture interaction because, again, if they have the good mothers, then they actually thrive. Now, the other thing that often comes about when we're talking about developmental psychology, and particularly lifespan development, is whether or not development is continuous or if it's stage-like or discontinuous. And when we talk about continuity or being continuous, we talk about this gradual change. We're talking about discontinuous or stage-like theories. These advocates are saying that how you think in one stage of your life is qualitatively different than how you think at another period in your life. For example, we're going to be talking about Piaget in this chapter, and he was a proponent of the stage-like theory. There's also the debate of whether timing matters, timing when something happens in development. There's one branch that suggests that, yes, timing does matter, and that's ethology. Ethology stresses that behavior is strongly influenced by biology and evolution, and they talk about this as being characterized by these critical or sensitive periods. The idea here is that there is a certain sensitive period where people might be more apt to learn certain things. And this was really brought to prominence by Konrad Lorenz, who was an ethologist who studied imprinting in geese. And I have a link to a YouTube video here. What he did was he had these baby geese imprint on him like he was their mother. And what you found was that these geese actually treated him like he was their mother. But there was this critical time in a geese's life in which they determine who is their caretaker. And once they imprint on that person, they imprint on this person for life. And actually there's some really funny videos of these large geese following around Konrad Lorenz. More related to human development, though, Bowlby, he was one of the pioneer of human attachment theories, and he really believed that attachment during the first years of life was very important. For him, timing did matter.
You'll also see a section on brain development in this chapter, some brain basics. I'm going to cover it in terms of the 4 major lobes, and we'll discuss other things as they become relevant. But when we think about the brain, there's a tremendous amount of growth. At birth, the brain is 25% of its adult weight, and at age of 2, it's approximately 75% of its adult weight. And so you're going to be seeing that up through even early adulthood, around 25, there are going to be changes in our growth of our brain. Now, the brain is composed of 4 major lobes, and the maturity of these lobes doesn't happen uniformly, and that certain areas are going to mature faster than others. We're going to take a look at these 4 different lobes. We'll start with the occipital lobe, and that's pictured here in green. And what I have here is a side view of the brain. Now, to the left, it's a full brain, and you can see that there are 2 halves. And what we can talk about is sometimes lateralization, where there's the right side being more recruited versus the left side being more recruited, and we say that there's lateralization. But as you can see in this cross section with the 4 lobes, you could look at it from either side and you'd have a similar view. But within the back area is the occipital lobe. Now, this is located at the very back of your head. So if you put your hand right above your neck on your skull there, what you would be feeling right there is your occipital lobe. Now, the occipital lobe deals with vision functions. And I always give this example because I think it's happened to all of us, unfortunately. When you slip and fall and you hit the back of your head, things go yellow. And that's because you've hit your occipital lobe, which is dealing with vision. Now, the parietal lobe, which is a little bit above it, deals with spatial location, attention, and motor control, such as hand-eye coordination. Again, so the parietal lobe has a lot to do with spatial things, attention, and motor control. Now, the other lobe, the temporal lobe, what I want you to think about that one is the temporal lobe is located closer to the ear. So we think about hearing tempo, right? And the temporal lobe is one that deals with hearing, language processing, and also memory. So again, think about it in terms of what you're hearing in terms of that language processing aspect. And relate that to tempo to try to remember that the temporal lobe deals with audition. And then finally, the frontal lobe, which is in the front of the brain. So if I put my hand where my forehead is, that's where the frontal region is. This deals with higher order thinking, such as reasoning, decision making, planning. So this is a very important area of the brain, and it actually doesn't fully form until the age of 25. There's a particular region in the brain called the orbital prefrontal cortex that, like I said, up until the age of 25, it's still maturing.
We're now going to talk about some of our key cognitive developmental theories. There are 2 main people that you should know, and they are Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget proposed the cognitive developmental theory, and Vygotsky has the socio-cultural cognitive theory, each of which we'll talk about in depth now. Piaget stressed conscious thought. He was really interested in how is it that thinking progresses. According to Piaget, infants seek to understand the world, and he talked about them doing so through organizing the world into isolated behaviors and thoughts into a scheme. So oftentimes when you talk about Piaget, you might hear the word schema. So these are, if you have a schema for a restaurant, you would say, okay, I go into that restaurant, I sit down at a table after someone escorts me to my seat. I'm given a menu. I order from the menu. I get my food. I pay. So that all forms a schema for what goes on when we go to a restaurant. And he talked about these schemas as a way for us to organize and represent the world. And cognitive growth and the development of these schemas really occurs through two processes. And the first way that we adapt these schemes or schemas are through assimilation processes. So when we talk about assimilation, we talk about it occurring when children use their existing schemes to deal with new information or experiences. So we use what's already out there to deal with new information. When we're talking about accommodation, this is whenever we're actually adjusting our scheme to take into account new information. So now we're having to modify. If we're talking about young infants, for example, assimilation can occur when they apply sucking behavior from breastfeeding to moving to a sippy cup. However, they will have to accommodate because they'll need to move their tongue in a different manner for the sippy cup. Sometimes children will experience what's called disequilibrium or cognitive conflict due to inconsistencies in their existing schemes, and they have to shift from one stage of thought to another, essentially shifting from assimilation to accommodation. And what this is kind of a balancing act between assimilating and accommodating. And so what they're doing is they're trying to find equilibrium here. You have to balance between change and growth as you're constantly getting this new information in. So do you take in the new information and in regards to what you already have and assimilate that new information in, or do you have to modify it? And that would be an example of accommodation. Piaget proposed that there were 4 stages of development. The first one being the sensory motor stage. Now, the sensory motor stage deals with infant cognitive development lasting from birth to 2 years of age. And as the name implies, is dealing with sensation and motor actions. So I perform a particular action, it produces a sensation. I hit the mobile above my crib, and it starts to spin. So my action of maybe accidentally swinging my arm up now produces this visual sensation. It's all about the coupling of motor action with a sensation. During this sensory motor stage, there is an important obstacle that children have to overcome, and that is understanding object permanence. And object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or touched. When you start off with infant, peekaboo is great because it's like you put your hands over your face, you're gone. Remove the hands, you're there. Put the hands over the face, you're gone. And so this works really well with them because they haven't grasped object permanence yet. They don't understand that whenever you occlude your face with your hands, that you're still there. When object permanence develops had been debated for many years. A lot of people underestimated infants' abilities, but what we do know is that during the sensory motor stage, they do develop object permanence. And people can say that even around 3.5 months of age, infants are just demonstrating object permanence. Now, the reason why I said people used to underestimate object permanence is because what they would do is they would do these studies where they, for example, would hide something underneath a blanket, and then they would look to see if the infants were looking for it. Well, some of these infants, they didn't have the ability to actually make that motor response. But what we have found is that very early on, infants do understand that something exists, even whenever they cannot see, touch it, or hear it. Following the sensory motor stage, which again was from birth to about the age of 2, Piaget proposed that there was a pre-operational stage from about 2 to 7 years of age. And here the children begin to represent the world with words, images, and drawings, and even engage in pretend play. So what's important here is that this is coinciding with their use of language, really. But yet there's going to be certain things that they can't do, and we're going to talk about some of those issues. Whenever they represent the world mentally, they're restricted to only the things that they can do physically. So just as I said before, this is whenever children are really representing the world through images and words. But there are going to be certain things that they still can't do. So again, a child cannot yet perform reversible mental actions. So whenever they perform an action, it's like they can't go back in time and undo it. We'll talk about 3 different types of errors that are characteristic of the pre-operational stage of thinking. The first one is egocentrism. The next one is animism. And the third one is conservation. Egocentrism is the inability to distinguish between one's own perspective and someone else's perspective. So when we talk about egocentrism, we're talking about I only see the world the way I see it. So I cannot take on your perspective. What I see is what you see. And I've given you an example of a YouTube video that you can watch that demonstrates this. Now this is demonstrated through what's called the mountain problem. And what they do in the mountain problem is that they'll have a child sit on a certain side and they'll ask him or her, what do you see? Okay, now I'll have you sit on the side that I was sitting on before, and now what do you see? And then we'll ask, okay, so now that I'm sitting on this other side, what do I see? And what we find is that the child will report what they're currently seeing on their side, and assuming that what I see is what you see. The best way to learn this concept of egocentrism, though, is through an applied example. And so again, if you visit this YouTube video, you'll see an example of very cute kids either demonstrating egocentrism by reporting what they see, even though when they should be reporting what the experimenter sees. And also instances whenever they've overcome egocentrism, they're in the next stage, which we'll be talking about shortly, and they can say, okay, I can distinguish from what I'm seeing from what you're seeing. The other type of error that is characteristic of this stage of development is animism. And animism is a belief that inanimate objects have lifelike qualities and are capable of action. The best example I can give is this one that I've drawn a emotion on a cloud. Say a 3-year-old might say something like, the cloud is crying because he is sad, or the sidewalk made me trip. What you have is inanimate objects that are incapable of feeling or incapable of tripping you, and they're saying that, these things have human-like qualities. The final type of error that we're going to talk about are errors of conservation. And when we talk about conservation, we're talking about altering a substance's appearance does not change its basic properties. The case that a lot of times people use is called the beaker problem. And what we have here in A is we have 2 beakers in this example up top, A and B. And what the experimenter does, the experimenter pours in front of the child the liquid from B into C. And then they ask the child, okay, which one has more, glass A or glass C, or do they have the same? Now the child just saw the action being performed of B going into C. The answer is they have the same. But children on the stage say that C has more. And they're likely to say this because the fact that C is taller. And what this is an example of what's called centration. And centration is centering attention on one characteristic. So here they're centered on the height of the glass. So again, conservation deals with, although we've changed the physical appearance, the basic properties are the same. So the basic property is that this has the same amount of liquid, but they get centered on the fact that C is taller, and so they say C has more. Now please watch this YouTube video here. It's going to give you an example of the beaker problem. And again, you'll see cute kids demonstrating conservation or lack thereof. And also you will learn how to, I call scam a kid whenever you see the cookie example. They're very funny. So do watch those videos, and again, it will apply the principles of conservation here. The first example will be getting fixated on height. There's another example getting fixated on length, and the final example, the scam a kid example that I refer to is with the cookie, is focusing on number. The next stage we'll talk about is the concrete operational stage. According to Piaget, the concrete operational stage occurs between the ages of about 7 to 11, and now they can perform concrete operations and think logically. So what they couldn't do before in the pre-operational stage, now they can. So now they can reverse situations. So they can master conservation so that they could mentally reverse that beaker problem and understand that, hey, A is the same as C. Also, they can do other various things as well, such as master seriation. And what's meant by seriation is that they can have the ability to order stimuli along a quantitative dimension. So, for example, they can arrange objects from lightest to darkest, or tallest to smallest here. They can also do things such as transitive inferences. This is the ability to logically combine relations to understand certain conclusions. So if I gave you the relationship between two objects, such as there are 3 sticks, a yellow one, a green one, and a blue one, and these sticks are shown to you, and I tell you that the yellow stick is longer than the green one, and the green one is longer than the blue, and I ask you then, without physically comparing the yellow and blue sticks, which one is longer, you should be able to say that the yellow one is longer than the blue one. And children do this. Without physically measuring the 2 sticks, they know that if they have the relationship between the yellow and the green one, and the green and the blue, then they understand the relationship between the yellow and the blue. They can also classify and divide objects into substages, such as a family tree where a son can be a father as well. And they can sort objects into categories such as shape, color, or both, and understand that there are subclasses such as a rose is a type of flower. So it's just more sophisticated thinking. The final stage according to Piaget is the formal operational stage. According to Piaget, the formal operational stage is from ages 11 and beyond. And here Piaget says that, adolescents develop the highest level of cognitive development in which they can think about information more flexibly, they can manipulate information, they're no longer limited to the concrete here and now. Along with this abstract thinking, we see that there's increased verbal problem-solving ability, there's increased tendency to think about thought itself and be a reflective thinker. And also, the final point that Piaget made was it involves hypothetical deductive reasoning. So you can create a hypothesis and deduce its implications. So for example, if you ask a child how to swing a pendulum so that it hits the side of the wall, they could experimentally manipulate things like the string length one at a time, and then see how that affects where the pendulum swings. They could manipulate then if the weight of the object. And so what they do is they make hypotheses about what's determining this pendulum swing and then manipulate it systematically. Whereas if you saw a child doing that was younger, it would be more haphazardly that they were trying to figure this out. So they're really now thinking about, okay, if I do this, what will be the consequence? But it's not all good when it comes to thinking, and especially in adolescence. So as we develop, our frontal lobe, which is the very front part of our brain, becomes more developed. But this isn't fully achieved until our 20s, and so what you find is that during the stage of adolescence, there's a specific challenge, and that is something that's called adolescent egocentrism. So when we talked about the pre-operational stage, we talked about egocentrism being the case that you couldn't separate your own thinking from someone else. So what I see is what you see. Now here what we talk about adolescent egocentrism is really the self-focused thought. And here they have this heightened self-consciousness of themselves. They oftentimes are thought to have this imaginary audience. So they believe that others are interested in them as they are in themselves. So I can't go to the store, Mom, because I have a pimple and everyone will notice. So it's things like that. Now, probably not everyone's going to notice. Probably people are going to be shopping. For them, though, you have to consider it from their perspective. Since they have this imaginary audience, they think everyone is as interested in them as they are in themselves. There's also this personal fable that is characterized by this adolescent egocentrism. And this personal fable is one in which this involves a sense of uniqueness and invincibility. The personal fable held by some adolescents is that what happens to them is unique, exceptional, and shared by no one else. For example, teenagers whose romantic relationships have ended may feel that no one has ever experienced the hurt they feel, that no one has ever been treated so badly, and that no one could possibly understand what they're going through. Even when we tell them, hey, everyone's had a heartbreak before, and we try to console them, sometimes because of this personal fable, they're thinking like, no, this is unique to me. There's also the case of the adolescent risk-taking and reckless behavior. So sometimes this idea of I'm invincible during the stage can lead to risk-taking, and this is traced again to personal fables that they construct for themselves, such as, I'm invincible, so other people might have unprotected sex and get pregnant, but I won't. Other people might try drugs and get hooked, but I won't. We kind of have to walk them through and let them know that, there are consequences and that this could happen to anyone. With any theory, we have to then think about, what are some of the pros and cons of the theory? And so when we're evaluating Piaget's theory, one thing that people talk about is that really Piaget kind of took away from his theory what the environment is doing to progress how children are thinking. Now, when we talk about Vygotsky, he's going to be taking the approach that the environment is very important, that culture is very important in terms of shaping how people think. But Piaget largely ignores the social environment and talks about it from a constructivist perspective that cognition is developing through a series of stages, but really ignores the cultural aspect. Also, we talked about how there's the continuous versus the discontinuous debate in development. And Piaget's theory is talked about in terms of stages, and cognitive development is likely not as stage-like as Piaget thought. So there's more individual variation than Piaget envisioned. So for example, with individual variation by task, sometimes you'll find that a child is in the concrete operational stage, but then you ask them a question and they might act as if they're in the pre-operational stage. Or you might have the case where someone's in the pre-operational stage, you ask them a question and they look more like they're in the concrete operational stage. Also, there's a tendency for some individuals to develop formal thinking earlier, while others never seem to display this, for example, hypothetical deductive reasoning. And again, this idea of this individual variation, that some children can be trained to reason at a higher stage earlier on, and really this idea that Piaget might have underestimated abilities. But on the whole, Piaget developed the notion of children as active, constructive thinkers and developed many concepts that are still used today, such as assimilation, accommodation, schemes. And we do know that children oftentimes do show some of these characteristics, such as egocentrism, animism, conservation problems, adolescent egocentrism, but trying to pinpoint and say that you're at this age, therefore you will be displaying it, is too simplistic. And again, we have to take into account the context. With that being said, that leads us to Vygotsky. And Vygotsky was a theorist who truly believed that social interactions and culture influence learning. He also, like Piaget, thought that children actively construct their knowledge. So this is a point that they both agree on. But again, it's social interaction and culture that's guiding cognitive development, which Piaget ignored. Vygotsky talked about how learning is based on the inventions of society. So if you are in a computer-based society versus you're in one that relies on beads, then your thinking is going to be reflected in terms of what is available for you to learn with. And the social environment is very important, with less skilled people learning from those that are more skilled. This is exactly what happens in teaching. You have the teacher who's instructing the less skilled. In programs such as Montessori, you have the older children working with some of the younger children. Again, the person who has more skills is mentoring the one with less skills. And two key terms that Vygotsky introduced were zone-proximal development and scaffolding. And when he's talking about the zone of proximal development, this is the region in which you're able to learn some new information. And what you do is you scaffold. So for example, whenever you're teaching a child mathematics, you first start off with numbers. Once they have mastered numbers, then you start them off with addition and subtraction. Okay, so now within their zone of proximal development, now they can move on to the next one, and we're going to need more assistance in learning now multiplication and division. But they're not going to need assistance in things like number concepts and addition and subtraction because they've mastered that. So you put your level of support in getting them to that next level and helping them to master, in this example, multiplication and division. Lastly, to talk about Vygotsky, we have to consider the role of language. Vygotsky believed that language was useful for cognitive development. Since his theory is based on the social interaction, that makes sense because language is a communication tool. But he also saw it as a tool for which individuals could problem solve and monitor their own behavior. So when Vygotsky looks at language, he thinks about there's this transition from when I'm working on a task as a younger child, I'm using external language. I'm saying, okay, now I'm going to put this in the bowl. Now I'm going to stir the ingredients in the bowl. To using internal language, or the children are saying to themselves, this is what I'm doing, but it's private speech. And he says that those who are using private speech oftentimes do better because they're guiding their behavior. So language is crucial to Vygotsky. How do we apply this to teaching? We can think of Vygotsky as giving us specific teaching strategies. The first is we need to effectively assess the child's zone of proximal development, here listed as ZPD. Again, the zone of proximal development is a range of tasks that are too difficult for the child alone, but that can be learned with guidance. So in the example, like I said before, whenever they've mastered addition and subtraction, now their zone of proximal development is multiplication and division. So that's where we're going to be providing the assistance. We can use the child's zone of proximal development in teaching so that, again, we are putting our instruction focus to those elements that are just within reach. They're within their zone. We can use more skilled peers as tutors, especially in the case whenever we have a large section and we want to have smaller groups, so we can use those who are excelling to work with those who are having a little bit more problems. We can monitor and encourage the child's use of private speech. Again, private speech for Vygotsky is seen as a self-regulation device that is useful to guide their behavior and help them problem solve. We can also place instruction in a meaningful context. Again, thinking about the culture, if we have it in a meaningful context, we can see that the child is likely to grasp the information more readily, see what its applications are. Just to compare the two, Vygotsky and Piaget, we'll talk about just a few essential aspects from this figure here to reiterate a few points. Again, Vygotsky is very much a proponent that the social environment and culture shapes learning and thought, whereas Piaget put little emphasis on it. The role of language, again, Vygotsky saw it as playing a major role in shaping thought, whereas Piaget thought it had a minimal role. With their views on education, Vygotsky thought that education played a central role with shaping children's thought, whereas Piaget just saw it as merely refining the thought. So it's already there. It's just education just polishes it. And both of them, though, view the teacher as a facilitator and guide. And what this means for us is that we, again, are allowing children to develop as we are looking after them. With the case of Vygotsky, we're looking to see with their zone of proximal development. We are trying to have the more skilled teach the less skilled. And Piaget, you can think of him as the one who thinks of children as the little experimenter, that we need to give them a good environment so that they can actively create and explore their world.
As you can see, language was very important to Vygotsky. It's an important component of cognition. Therefore, we're going to turn to Chapter 5, which focuses on language.
There's also this idea of this language acquisition or nature-nurture debate with people asking, well, is it more nature or is it more nurture? Returning to that nature-nurture debate that we talked about previously. And what we'll find is that it's both. But we'll talk about some biological influences that have suggested that language does have a nature component. The first being is that there are similarities in language development across the world. So what we find is that kids babble and coo and around the same period of time. So they go through the milestones in the same order. There are also particular brain regions used for language, and damage to these areas produce aphasias. And so whenever we look at Broca's areas, Broca's area is one in which it's part of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is in the very front part of your brain. So if you put your hand up to your forehead, we would be talking with the frontal lobe. And this is used for planning. And so when someone has had damage to this area, they can understand what you're saying. But whenever they go to articulate it, they have these grammar-related deficits in production. It doesn't seem like they're making sense whenever they are telling you an answer to your question, but actually the content is there. It's just the production is so far off because they have a hard time planning out what they're saying. The other area is Wernicke's area, and that's in the temporal lobe, which is on the sides. Think about it being close to your ears. And this has to do with language comprehension. So when you ask someone who has damage to the Wernicke's area a question, what you get is a grammatically correct sentence, but it has no content, it has no meaning. It's not related to the question you asked them, although again, the grammar is intact, but the utterance doesn't seem to make sense. So in some, just a visual. So there's Broca's area and the frontal area and Wernicke's and the temporal. And what we find is that there seems to be a biological component, because whenever someone has damage to one of these two areas, they show these different tendencies of either being unable to produce language correctly, or being unable to efficiently comprehend what someone's saying to them. Finally, with regard to evidence for biological influences, is this idea that we have this language acquisition device. Now, this was proposed by Noam Chomsky, who was really the proponent who got us thinking about cognitive psychology, who showed us that behaviorism alone could not account for language. So if you go on and take more psychology classes, you'll hear a lot about Noam Chomsky's contribution to the field of psychology. But what he talked about was that there's this biological endowment that enables children to detect certain features and rules of a language. And what we know is that infants come into this world distinguishing between different phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest unit of sound. And so the infant comes into this world able to distinguish all of these different phonemes of all these different languages, because an infant doesn't know where he or she's going to be born. What happens is gradually over time, these phonemes drop off, the ones that they're not hearing in their environment, become equipped to be able to learn and recognize the sound of any language. We also know that deaf children, even whenever they are brought up in a home where they have parents that can hear, they still develop their own language oftentimes. So whenever they are introduced to situations where there's another deaf children or child, they often will develop ways to communicate through symbols between each other. So again, deaf children of hearing parents make up their own sign language, even without instruction, suggesting that there is this biological tendency to put certain rules into language to make it meaningful for communication. And now we'll talk about environmental influences. So behaviorists claimed early on that you could train a child through language. So what would happen is a child would utter something and then I'd get really excited and reinforce them and smile and laugh, and then they would do it again. And then whenever they would say something bad, I'd be like, no, that's not how you do it, and correct them. We know this actually is not the case. Their language is complex. We don't systematically correct children when they're saying something inappropriate, and we don't reinforce them every time they say something. So behaviorism, if you hear about it from B.F. Skinner, there's a lot of classical psychology text about behaviorism. Behaviorism couldn't account for language development alone, but what we do know, though, is that there are certain aspects of the environment, particularly with parents, that is influencing, though, language development. And here's how. Children's vocabulary is linked to a family's socioeconomic status and the type of talk parents direct to their children. Now, there was a study that looked at parents who used a variety of words, and this is oftentimes linked to vocabulary level of the parent, with parents of higher socioeconomic status oftentimes having a higher vocabulary ability. And it's shown that these parents, it's not that they're talking more to their children, is that they're talking using more words to their children. And so their children go on to develop a greater vocabulary set as well. Also, these type of parents, the type of talk that they direct toward their children oftentimes involves pointing and gesturing, again facilitating their acquisition of new information and new words.
So language is a matter of nature and nurture influences, but you'll notice that there are some basic language milestones, and for those milestones I'd like for you to refer to Table 5.1. Other details about language include vocabulary and meaning. What we know is by the age of 6, most children understand up to 20,000 words. That's a lot of words, right? But they can only use about 2,600. So there's a difference between their understanding and also their expression of these words. We also know that with advanced cognition, children begin to use abstract words, and they also understand hypothetical situations. So going back to Piaget's theory of cognitive development, there's a distinction between those two stages with concrete and abstract thinking. In regards to grammar and syntax, we know that initially new rules may be applied too widely, such as broked instead of broken. The chair is broked instead of the chair is broken. And as we learn the rules, we begin to correct these errors. And the other thing to think about in terms of syntax is this next bullet point. So the first one was more with grammar. With syntax, we understand direct rather than passive language, more so for English learners. And there are some cultural variations, but when you're thinking about how you're speaking to young children, using a direct rather than a passive tense will facilitate their understanding of your request or your command. And lastly, with regards to pragmatics, that's just our knowledge about how to use language. This is one that's always been very interesting to me because I encourage you to make observations in your everyday life. And one of the things you'll notice is if you watch a young child speak to, say, a toddler, that young child will speak very differently to that young toddler than he or she does to you. And so we learn at a very young age when, where, how, and whom to speak. Now, a huge topic within language is dual language, bilingualism, just meaning that we know more than one language. And we know that children can learn two languages at once if given adequate opportunities in both languages. So you see a lot of schools that are like the Spanish school where children will go to that, and they'll also be in a program where they're learning English as well. So we know that if given the opportunity, they can master both. There are many cognitive advantages to learning more than one language. I do a lot of stuff with adult learning, and particularly with older adults. And so a lot of the research that I've encountered has really discussed the benefits of being bilingual. For example, there's some work by Bialystok and Krueger, and they show that in later adulthood, bilinguals actually show less cognitive decline. And that's because they're constantly having to inhibit one language over the other. So they do a lot better suppressing information that isn't relevant later on in late adulthood, 65 and beyond. So there seems to be a cognitive advantage for being bilingual that extends well into late adulthood. So people often say, well, can you learn language after a certain age? And you can. But the best time to learn accurate pronunciation is early childhood. So if you talk to a lot of perception researchers, they will specifically focus on this pronunciation issue. So if you're going to sound like a fluent native speaker, start early. And also it should be noted that when we talk about language, it's not just spoken language. Sign language is considered a second language as well. And those who communicate in two sign languages are bilingual. Or if you have a sign language and another spoken language, such as English and sign language, you're bilingual. You might have also heard about dialects. And dialects are any variety of language spoken by a particular group. And when we have a certain dialect, this includes variation in vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. So for example, before I met my husband's in-laws, my sister-in-law told me, she's like, yeah, sometimes the people in this region are known as the Yat people. And I was like, what's the Yat people? And it's the way that they phrase things. Where you at becomes where yat. So they have different ways of speaking and different terms and different pronunciations. And so we can think about different dialects, and you can probably think of a number of dialects that come to mind as we're discussing this. It can differ by region, even within small distances and communities. But one of the things that we have to be very cautious about as educators is that we need to be sensitive to stereotypes. Just because someone is speaking a certain dialect doesn't mean that this says anything about their intelligence, for example, about their personality traits. It's just a manner of speaking. And so what we really need to do is focus on understanding and accepting students' language, but one of the things we have to do is also prepare students for the outside world and for professionalism. So while it may be fine to speak that dialect, when it comes to writing a formal paper, then the formal linguistics need to be followed. So formal professional writing styles, formal tone, and so forth. Now going back to being multilingual, we can also think about teaching immigrant students and English language learners, or sometimes you see it shortened as ELLs, E-L-L-S. Some names for English learners can be limited English proficient. You'll sometimes see that in the literature. I more likely see ELL, English language learners. And then you'll also see ESL, which is English as a second language. And particularly you'll see classes devoted to teaching these students English. When we think about bilingual education, we'd say it works best if students are not forced to abandon their native language. Instead, we can think about these as complementing each other. And we know that children who have a greater mastery of their first language, so the greater mastery of, say, Spanish compared to their peers who also are speaking Spanish, that those children who are scoring higher on vocabulary tests in their native language also typically master the second language faster. And we can think about having different profiles of English language learners. Like I said, I typically use ELLs, E-L-L. We can think about balanced bilinguals. These are bilinguals who are going to speak, read, and write well in their first language and in English. Oftentimes we'll have monolingual or literate students, so they're literate in their native language but speak limited English. Then there's the monolingual pre-literate students. They might not read or write in their native language, or they may have very limited literacy skills. So we think about some very early on in childhood, we oftentimes will have these pre-literate students. And then we have limited bilinguals, and those are the students who can converse well in both language, but for some reason or another, they're having trouble academically. So as we think about teaching ELLs, one thing we can think about is this generation 1.5. And when we talk about generation 1.5, these are students whose characteristics, educational experiences, and language fluencies are somewhere between those of the students born in the United States and those who are recent immigrants. So they've lived most of their lives in the United States, but the language at home sometimes is not English. And they often can speak fluent conversational English, but going back to that last profile, the academic English sometimes is not well developed. So they tend to be ear learners. Therefore, we have to think about, teaching ELL students and think about what's going to be meaningful for them. First, we would begin with a formal assessment of where they currently are. We'd also want to use small group interventions to focus on the areas that are needed. So going back to Vygotsky's principles, you're looking at the scaffolding in the zone of proximal development. If you've mastered something already, you don't want to devote your time to that, but you look instead where the area of improvement or instruction is needed so that you can help guide them until they get to that level where they're on their own and have mastered it, and then you go to the next step that they need. We can target teaching essential vocabulary, such as content and common words, and we can directly teach academic English. So again, preparing them for that context. Also, going back to Vygotsky, making wide use of peer-assisted learning, particularly working in pairs to complete academic tasks. So thinking about this in terms of your partners, one might have more strength in something than another, and by their group work, they can assist each other. So when we're thinking about teaching ELL students, again, the idea is not to completely abandon their other language, but really think about where they are, how much they've mastered, thinking about what level of instruction you need to do in order to help them with areas that they may be struggling with, and also using peers in terms of facilitating their learning.